people who feel most financially stuck in retirement aren't the ones with the least money. They're the ones whose money is all sitting in the walls of a house that no longer fits their life. And this is the one of the least talked about parts of aging and downsizing, because from the outside, everything still looks fine. The house is paid off, there's no mortgage, by every traditional measure that's supposed to mean financial security. But behind the scenes, the monthly reality looks very different. Property taxes that keep climbing, insurance that never goes down, maintenance that keeps showing up, and a property that's become physically harder to manage with every passing year. Today I want to talk about what that actually looks like in real life, why so many people stay in that situation longer than they should, and what's possible on the other side of it that most people never think to explore. Here's what I mean when I say house rich, cash poor. I worked with a couple not long ago who owned their home completely free and clear. No mortgage, they paid it off years ago. On the surface, that sounds like exactly where you'd want to be heading into retirement. But their situation had quietly shifted in ways that crept up on them gradually. The house sat on about an acre, which was wonderful when they were younger and could manage it themselves. But as they got older, the lawn care became too much to handle physically and had to be hired out. And that cost was showing up every single month and increasing. Their property taxes had been climbing steadily for years because the home had appreciated significantly, which sounds like good news on paper, but when you're on a fixed income, a higher tax bill doesn't feel like good news. It feels like pressure. And then the HVAC went out. A necessary repair, not optional, not something that could be deferred, and paying for a new system with out of pocket on a fixed income was genuinely a struggle. And here's what struck me about their situation. They had substantial wealth, it was just locked inside the walls of a house that was quietly working against them instead of for them. They weren't irresponsible, they hadn't made bad decisions, they'd done everything right by the traditional playbook. Paid off the house, build equity, that's supposed to be the goal, but nobody told them that the house could become the problem. And this happens more than most people realize because it doesn't show up all at once, it builds slowly. A house that once felt like stability and success starts feeling heavier to carry. Maintenance gets deferred because the cost feels overwhelming. Parts of the house stop getting used because the layout no longer works. Travel gets postponed. Helping kids or grandkids financially feels out of reach. Healthcare decisions start getting influenced by the cost of maintaining the property. And because it happens gradually, people adjust to it a little at a time without always realizing how much of their daily life has started revolving around managing the house instead of actually enjoying their life. Sometimes people stop enjoying the home years before they actually leave it. And they stay, not because they love everything about the situation, but because they made an assumption that most people in this position make. They assume they don't have another option. That assumption is usually where I start the conversation, because what I found is that most people in this situation have never actually looked at what's possible. They've already decided the answer is no without really checking. They assume moving somewhere else would be financially impossible, or that anything they could afford would be a significant step down, or that the stress of making a change would outweigh whatever they might gain. And sometimes after really thinking it through, staying is generally the right answer. I've seen that too, and there's nothing wrong with it when it's a real choice rather than a default. But a lot of times the options look very different once somebody actually sits down and looks at the full picture. What is the home actually worth right now? What would the equity free up? What would monthly costs look like somewhere else? And are there financing options available that might make something possible that seems out of reach? That last question is where the couple I mentioned earlier had their biggest surprise. After years of assuming they couldn't afford to make a move, they discovered there was a financing option specifically designed for homeowners in their situation. One that allowed them to purchase a home that actually fit their life without the financial strain that they've been living with. No more acres to maintain, a layout that worked for them, and monthly costs that made sense on their fixed income. And the thing that they said afterward that I keep coming back to is that they wish somebody had told them this was possible years earlier. Not because the old house wasn't meaningful to them, it was, but because they'd been carrying a burden for longer than they needed to. So what does starting that conversation actually look like? It usually begins with one honest question. What do you want your home to do for you in the next chapter of life? Not what it did before, not what it represented 10 or 20 years ago, right now. Do you want less maintenance, more flexibility, lower monthly overhead, single story, closer to family, a home that doesn't demand constant attention? Because once people start answering those questions honestly, the conversation shifts. It stops being about giving something up, and it becomes about whether the home is still supporting the life they actually want to be living. And those are two very different conversations. After watching this play out with a lot of families, I know the people who feel best about how this conversation and transition went almost always say a version of the same thing. They didn't realize how much energy, money, and mental space the house had been quietly consuming until it wasn't anymore. And the ones who stayed, not because it was genuinely the right fit, but because the change felt too uncertain, often look back wishing they'd at least explored what was possible before assuming the answer was no. Intentional decisions look different from automatic ones. And your home is supposed to support your life, not quietly limit it. If any part of this conversation sounds familiar, whether it's the rise in costs, the maintenance, the feeling that the home has become more of a burden than an asset, it might be worth having a real conversation about what your options actually look like before assuming you already know. Because most people in this situation are surprised by what they find when they actually look. If you want to understand what real options look like for where people go when they downsize, I have a video that walks through all of the options in plain practical terms, and that's a great one to check out. And if you're in the San Antonio area and want to sit down and actually map out what this could look like for your situation, I genuinely welcome that conversation. You might be closer to a better situation than you think.